are given power not to advance our own purpose, nor to make a great show in the world, nor a name. There is but one just use of power, and it is to serve people. President George Walker Bush. In the 8 years President Bush served the American people, he reminded us on many occasions of the rare opportunities we enjoy in this country to guide our own destinies with hard work and determination. He showed us that love of family and faith are qualities that transcend boundaries between nations and political parties. And President Bush demonstrated to the world that no matter who you are, no matter where you are, if you're in distress and in need of a helping hand, the United States will be there to lift you up. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you very much for the rousing reception. Whatever you said in your introduction, I need to take it. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm looking forward to answering questions from that. So I'm lying on the couch in Crawford after having watched the peaceful transfer of power. And Laura walks in. I said, "Free at last." She said, "Yeah, buddy, you're free. You're now free to do the dishes." I said, "Wait a minute, babe, you're talking to the former president of the United States." She said, "It's your new domestic policy agenda." I do feel free. I really do. I love being your president, and frankly, I love not being your president. Unbelievable experience. But I made the decision to, kind of get off the stage. My view is that you're on the stage, in my case for 8 years, and then it's time to get off the stage and wish your successor well. I think it's important. I think it's bad for the presidency, frankly. How hard I try to stay off the stage, occasionally I have to tiptoe back on it. Like last night, the president called me, for which I was very grateful, and informed me that Osama bin Laden had been killed. My reaction was... I congratulated the president, as well as congratulating the intelligence community and the special operators who brought the man to justice. America is strong, and we are patient when it comes to delivering justice. This is not an act of revenge. It's not an act of hatred. It's an act of giving this guy the justice he deserves. Speaking about Laura, she's doing great. She too is happy to be off the stage. It's interesting. So I used to have a 45-second commute to home. And now it's a little bit longer. And so our paths are kind of diverging away. She's giving a lot of speeches. I'm giving a fair amount of speeches. When we see each other, it's generally on the ranch. She was an awesome first lady. One time I'm giving a speech and said, Laura Bush was the greatest first lady ever. And then I realized my mother was on the front row. She said, when you get up there, make sure you not try to, get in the limelight too much. I said, I agree, babe, but I said, I got to sell my book. So I have been submerged. I emerged after I wrote the book. I want to share some thoughts about the book with you, and I'm going to answer some questions. It may be shameless marketing in my case, so if you haven't bought it, So why write a book? It's a fundamental question. Well, one, I think you have an obligation as president to do so. Secondly, I do not believe that there is such a thing as accurate short-term history. I don't see how an historian can possibly analyze my administration or anybody else's administration, recent administration, without the passage of time. I mean, obviously there's prejudices that cloud vision, there's preconceived notions that cloud vision. There needs to be time in order for an accurate history to be done on anybody's recent administration. So therefore, the book is a way of saying to future historians, or is a reference point for future historians, if you want one person's point of view, in this case the guy in the middle of the storm, read the book. Secondly, many of you have to make decisions in your life. I had to make a lot of decisions. That's what presidents do. And I was making decisions in a very complex environment. And so maybe there's some lessons you can learn from the book. Thirdly, it's kind of the closure for the presidency. I didn't realize it at the time. But it's closure. Gosh, I remember when the book came out, there was a lot of surprise. I mean, a lot of people here on the East Coast didn't think I could read, much less write. And we kind of ended the presidency in a way. I mean, you're never not former president, but the presidency itself, kind of finally the curtain closed. And so you read it. It's not a judgmental book. It doesn't say so-and-so was a jerk. And, you know, it just, here's what I saw. It's very anecdotal. I love telling stories. I'm going to try to tell you some here today. The first decision in the book was why run for president at all. I mean, if there's any Texans out there, you know what I'm about today is true. I was living as the governor of the Promised Land. And I really, once you drink the water down there, you understand you never want to drink water anywhere else. I mean, Texas is an awesome place. And Laura and I love living there. Our life was pretty comfortable, and so I run. And in order to make that decision cogent to you, the reader, I have to describe the person making the decision. And the opening sentence in the book is, can you tell me a day in which you have not had a drink? You know, like most of these presidential memoirs, I guess, probably say, you know, he was born in a log cabin. Not true in my case. Anyway, so... Although much to your amazement, probably amazement, I was actually born in my father's sophomore year in college. Thankfully, all the paperwork aligned properly. Otherwise, Mother would have had a lot of explaining to do. And it's my wife, Laura, saying, tell me a day in which you haven't had a drink. And none of you ever drank too much out there, but I couldn't tell her a day. I mean, so I started racking my brain. I could not think of one day in which I had not had a drink of alcohol. And so her kind of gentle way of prodding me to kind of reassess values in my life reminded me that I was falling in love with alcohol more than I was in love with my family, which is one of the great acts of irresponsibility, by the way. And so it's the beginning of the end of me drinking. I kind of put that in there. I'm kind of a provocative guy. You know, I used to tell people I had my daddy's eyes and my mother's mouth. And so it's kind of a way of grabbing your attention. And so I walked through my relationship with my father, for example. There's a lot of psychobabble in Washington about the relationship between W and 41, as if there's some kind of competition. Look, you got to understand, I wouldn't be standing here without the unconditional love of my dad. For you fathers out there, you got to understand, I know many of you do, that when you provide unconditional love, it inspires a son or a daughter. Like running for president is risky. You can run and lose and say, what a pathetic candidate. Or you can run and win and they say, what a pathetic president. Either way, it doesn't matter if you have the unconditional love of somebody you admire, and I admire George H.W. Bush a lot. president. The truth of the matter is, for the youngsters here, I didn't want it to be said, you know, all these guys sitting around and people say, oh man, you'd have been a great president. And you never tried. I couldn't think of anything worse, as a matter of fact, to have had an opportunity and failed to seize it. So I tell my buddies, you know, when I die, I want my dance card to have been completely full. And running for the president was part of that. I talk about, in the book, obviously, key moments, one of which is on people's minds today, which was September the 11th. And so what I try to do is just walk you through the moment. Many of you lived it. But there's a lot of Americans who never did. You know, they're like young kids now that weren't alive. My view is that September the 11th would be like Pearl Harbor after a period of time. But for those of us who lived through the moment, it's essential to remind future generations of the risks entailed in being a free society. And so I was sitting in a classroom listening to a reading lesson. I had been informed that a plane had hit the World Trade Center just as I walked in the classroom. All of us thought it was an accident. Andy Card whispers in my ear, a second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack. My first reaction was anger. I kind of flared up, you know, who the hell did this? My second reaction was caused by looking at the child reading. And I can vividly remember the contrast between innocence and evil. And my job was clarified. The most important job of any president is to protect America from harm. And then I saw the press getting the calls in the back there. It was like a silent movie. Picking up these cell phones. And it was apparent to me that they were getting the same information I had just got. If you're ever the leader of an organization in a crisis, the first thing to do is to project calm. So my first decision was actually to do nothing but wait for the appropriate moment to exit the classroom. What I didn't want to do was create a psychological tsunami by causing there to be panic in the classroom amongst kids. And so I kind of waited for an appropriate moment and left. The second thing, if you're ever running an organization in the midst of a crisis, is you better fill a void. In other words, silence isn't acceptable if you're running an organization. There's a crisis. You have to tell people something. So I hastily scribbled together a statement and walked into a classroom full of parents who did not know the news and were expecting to hear the president say, man, you got a great reading program here. But instead they heard America's under attack. And it was you know, a lot of times it's hard for a president to kind of get out of a bubble. It turns out to be an important moment for me because I was able to see firsthand the shock that you felt, and the horror you felt, and the uncertainty you felt. I got hustled into a car, a limo, hurtling down the highway. Condi calls and says, a third plane has hit the Pentagon. And so I leaned back in the limo there, and first one was likely an accident, the second was an attack. And the third one was the declaration of war. And that's how I conducted my presidency for the remaining 7.5 years. And the truth of the matter is, as you'll see in the book, 9/11 led to a lot of decisions I had to make as how best to protect the country, many of which were incredibly controversial. I said I would do everything within the law. I got sworn in to hold the laws of the United States. When you get sworn in, that's what you say, and I meant it. So one of the most controversial decisions that I walked the reader through is the decision on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the man who ordered the death of 3,000 citizens. He was the person that slit Danny Pearl's throat because Danny Pearl was Jewish. In other words, he's a cold-blooded killer. We captured the guy. And so I'm told by the experts that he's got information about a further attack. My first reaction, of course, was find out what he knows. And if he's got information about an attack, and my job is to protect the American people, we need to know what he knows. His comments, after having been questioned by some of the interrogators, was, I'll talk to you when I get my lawyer in New York. I was told that we have techniques available to us that we get him to share information. I said, are they legal? My first question is, President, he said, are they legal? And after an exhaustive research, they came back and said they're legal. By the way, any of this stuff about somehow I manipulated the legal opinion to suit my needs is pure bull. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed talked. The information we got saved American lives. So here's the question for the president. See, here's what you do when you're the president. You got to make these kinds of decisions. One decision is whether to move forward. And can you get information to protect lives, even though it would end up being really controversial, and it was. But here's the other problem. The other side of the question. What happens if you didn't act? Yep. And there was an attack? And Americans died. And I wasn't going to let that happen. So I let the reader, you can draw whatever conclusion you want. The purpose of the book is just to put you in my shoes. I talk a lot about personalities. I believe strongly in personal diplomacy. So I think I hope you find it interesting about my relationship with leaders like Blair. This may come as a shock to you, but occasionally a politician might look you in the eye and tell you one thing and mean another. That's not Blair. When Blair looks you in the eye and tells you something, he means it. This guy showed incredible courage in the face of unbelievable political pressure. Until I researched the book, that I spent as much time with Putin as I had. I think I can't remember the exact number. I gotta be careful in case somebody's violating the rules of recording this. Anyway, so maybe 25 times or something like that. It's a lot of times you get to know somebody. You got to know him pretty well. One time at Camp David with Putin, and I introduced Putin to Barney. I don't remember Barney. Barney's a little Scottish Terrier, kind of tiny little legs, feisty little guy. They tend to punch above their weight, but they don't look very intimidating. After all, I didn't like the reporter. Anyway, so I said, "Look, you want to meet Barney?" Sure. Here's Barney. Kind I was placid. I wasn't going to let him know that he irritated me by dissing my man Barney. I just kind of... Anyway, so about a year later, we're at Putin's dacha outside of Moscow. I had completely forgotten about the Barney incident. I had a lot on my mind in those days. He said, "You want to meet my dog, Coney?" I said, "I'd like to meet Coney. Sure, that'd be interesting." And so out bounds this huge Russian lab, just kind of going across the lawn. And he looks at me and says, "Bigger, faster, and stronger than Barney." So I told the story to Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, and he said, "At least he only showed you his dog." So I called our team together. I said, "I want to tell you the story about Barney. If you want to know something about U.S.-Russian relations, just remember the story about Barney. My dog is bigger than your dog." Explains volumes. It's amazing what you can learn if you listen to people, if you get to know them on a personal basis, and listen to them. So Hu Jintao and I are having lunch. One of the things about meeting with the Chinese is really hard to have a one-on-one. Putin and I would get in rooms with interpreters and get after it, kind of in sometimes a friendly way, sometimes not so friendly way, but at least we made our points. Anyway, so with the Chinese, because of their system, it was hard to have a one-on-one. The definition of one-on-one was like 7 on 7. And since I never traveled with 7 people, it was like 7 on 3. Anyway, so not a micromanager. If you're running a complex organization, you've got to delegate. But in this case, I decided to decide who's going to be at my table for lunch Condi, me, in between was Hu Jintao, and the rest of the people were like clueless what was going on. I said, Mr. President, I'd like to share with people this comment. A terrorist attack keeps me up at night. That's what kept me up at night. When I was worried about something, it'd be another terrorist attack. So what keeps you up at night? I got to know him to the point where he's comfortable answering the question without hesitating. He said the creation of 25 million new jobs a year. It's a pretty startling answer, isn't it? And it explains a lot. So if you listen to what people tell you, at least in my case, I tried to. I learned a lot. I learned this, that China's inward looking. If you're worried about 25 million new jobs a year, you're worried about what happens inside your country. It explains a lot about their natural resource policies. It talks about their political system, because the truth of the matter is that if you're there because of history and tradition as opposed to the will of the people, you're nervous about unemployed masses inside cities upsetting the political apple cart. Anyway, the book gives you a series of vignettes about the different leaders with whom I was honored to serve. One of the most ironic relationships, by the way, was with Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan. What's the big deal with that? Well, on September the 12th, I get a phone call of 2001 from Koizumi saying, Japan and the United States will stand shoulder to shoulder to enhance our mutual security and spread freedom as the alternative to the ideology of the killers. 60 years prior to this conversation, roughly 60 years prior to this conversation, George H.W. Bush foregoes college to join the Navy to fight the Japanese. It's unbelievably ironic for me to be trying to make peace together with the Japanese when my dad and his dad fought each other. So what happened? Well, I believe freedom is transformative. One of the things you'll learn in this book is there was a set of principles from which I would not, which I wouldn't compromise. One of which is I believe freedom is universal. I believe in the soul of every man, woman, and child is a desire to live freely. And that if given a chance to live freely, peace follows. Maybe hard for you to detect it right now, but I believe what's happening in the Middle East is part of the laying the foundation for peace for generations to come. Japan adopts a Japanese-style democracy. Democracies are transformative, and Amin became an ally. Koizumi and I had such a great relationship that right before his final trip, on his final trip to America, he said, what do you want to do, man, when you come? He said, would you mind taking me to Graceland? Too bad. We went to Elvis's place. I don't know if anybody's here from Memphis. There's a great place called the Rendezvous Barbecue Joint. And Koizumi and I go, and one of the great moments of American diplomatic history to watch Koizumi sing Love Me Tender with an Elvis impersonator. One of the most difficult decisions of all was to use your money to bail out the economy. So one of the things that's important to understand that when you're running an organization, you better surround yourself with people whose judgment you trust. Because if you have people around just for the sake of having them around, kind of a therapeutic institute, you're not doing your shareholders or your, in my case, constituents any good. You've got to have people that are capable of not being intimidated by the title of the office, capable of analyzing, and capable of telling you what's on their mind. And you best trust them. So I'm sitting across the table from Bernanke and Paulson. Bernanke, the professor, had worked in the White House. I'd gotten to know him and liked him. Paulson and I were born the same year, 1946. Got out of college in 68. And I had really come to admire and trust in him a lot. And we'd been through several weekends of financial hell. And Bernanke says to me, I'm paraphrasing now, if you don't do something, Mr. President, that's substantial, you're likely to see a depression greater than the Great Depression. So here's the thing when you're the president. One, you trust and Paulson's nodding his head, he's right. He says, you trust these people? Or you ignore their advice? The threshold question is depression or no depression. That's the threshold question. I was a history major, not an economics major. But I read enough history to know I didn't want to be a president overseeing a Great Depression. I didn't want our people to go through a depression as great as the Great Depression. That's the threshold question. I campaigned and told you that I believe in markets, and the truth of the matter is, I wish they had all failed. You made a bad decision, you deserve to fail. But the nature of the presidency is such that sometimes the consequences of failure can affect a lot of other people. And that's the call you got to make. And so I said, I don't want to be the president overseeing a Great Depression. Then the next question is, what do you do about it? And the recommendation was take your money and give it to some of the firms that actually caused the dilemma in the first place. You know, I can't prove to you that, you know, somebody said, well, now TARP's a four-letter word. I said, it's always been a four-letter word. So I can't prove to you that the decision that was made, stopped the Great Depression, but I can just tell you it never happened. And that's the nature of the presidency. You just got to make the best judgment call you can make. And history will eventually solve it. I love these people say, oh, people trying to shape their legacy. Man, your legacy got shaped. It's over. I want to end by an interesting story. You know, one of the most, I thought interesting decisions I made was to, again, spend your money. You're pretty good about spending your money. To save lives on the continent of Africa. So, you're the president of the most powerful nation ever, and by the way, the greatest nation ever, the most compassionate nation ever. You can put every superlative you want on America, and I believe and there's a pandemic racing through an impoverished part of the world. In other words, an entire generation could be conceivably wiped out. You got something, you can do something about it. And I decided to do something about it for two reasons. One, for national security reasons. The guy that got killed yesterday can only recruit hopeless people. You got to be pretty hopeless, don't you, to say, I want to be a suicide bomber. That's hopelessness. Notice, he was never the suicide bomber, nor were his lieutenants. There's nothing more hopeless to be a kid on the continent of Africa and see your mom and dad die of AIDS and wealthy nations do nothing to help. To me, that's hopelessness. And creates bitterness, which creates a national security dilemma for the country. Secondly, I believe into the adage, to whom much is given, much is required. Many of you live that way yourselves. I think collectively as a nation, we should live that way. So I decided to do something about it. We set clear goals. Got a business guy to come and run what's called PEPFAR, the AIDS Initiative. We're not paternalistic in the delivery of aid. We just went to nations that were deeply affected and said, you devise a strategy, we'll help you devise it, and it's yours. That was what America just dumping money. It's America saying we want to work side by side, we need to solve the problem. We included faith-based organizations in the delivery of help. In other words, I didn't care what the delivery system was, all I cared is to make sure that they were effective. That's what government ought to ask. Can you be effective? Not the process, but what are the results? Thanks to your generosity, by the way. There's about 50,000 people on antiretrovirals. In other words, lives were being saved. Today it's over 4 million. And the program is successful. So I'm in Rwanda and with Laura, and we're traveling around there at the last year of my presidency. And we went to a program run by a religious organization that was teaching young girls how to thwart the advances of older men. A lot of these girls have never been told what's about to happen to them. Guys with AIDS will come and prey upon them, and it's part of how AIDS gets spread. It's actually an abstinence program. If you really want to irritate somebody in Washington, go down to the mall and scream, abstinence! My attitude, it works every time. Anyway, it certainly helped these girls, and that was what was important. Not the politics, But is it effective at helping stop the spread of AIDS? It's part of a comprehensive strategy. There's 50 kids watching Laura and me watch these girls being taught how to advance, what to expect. And I don't know why I did this, but I walked by. And by the way, most of these kids had lost their parents to AIDS. I just said, God is good. And they said, all the time. And it was a stunning moment. I was kind of getting old, you know. By the way, Medicare eligible this year. And so at least it'll be around for me. Anyway, so... I don't say that selfishly. It's kind of like a warning signal that comes. Anyway, so I said, God is good. I want to try it again to make sure I heard it right. They said, all the time. And I got back to Washington, and I said, if I can believe what I saw and heard in Rwanda. So 50 kids standing there watching Laura and me watch the program. And I said, God, it's going to be expecting to say there is no God. How can you possibly say that? You know, our lives are turned upside down. Hopelessly idealistic, optimistic guy. You are, Mr. President. And instead they said, all the time. I said, surely if 50 kids who have been affected, their lives turned upside down because of disease, can say all the time. Those of us who live in the most blessed nation ever, if we ever hear anybody say God is good, we Americans ought to be screaming at the top of our lungs all the time. Thank you for having me.